I was 19 the spring the Quail River came up over its banks and took half of Rhone's crossing down toward the sea. And I have lived long enough now to tell you that the flood did not only carry off barns and bridges. It carried a woman up our road on foot, mud to her knees, a boy's hand locked in hers, and it set her down in front of the hardest man I ever worked for. I watched the whole of it from the seat of a buckboard, with the rain still coming, and in 60 years I have not gotten clear of what I saw that day. You have to understand what the quail was. Most of the year she ran low and brown between her willows, a river you could wade with your boots on and not wet your knees, and the men who farmed her bottoms called her gentle and meant it. But she came down out of the Saddleback Hills, and when the spring thaw met 3 days of warm rain up high, she stopped being gentle. That April she rose 11 feet in a night. She took the Petrie place and the 2 Coyle farms and the schoolhouse and the lower mill. And she took a homesteader named Elias Mercer who went back into the water for his milk cow and never came up. And she left his widow and his son standing on a fence line in the dark with the river roaring not a yard below their feet. I did not see that part. I only ever heard it from her, years on, told flat and quiet the way she told the hard things, and even then she did not make herself the center of it. She made it about the cow. I told him let her go, she said once by the stove, not looking up from her mending. I told him a cow is a cow. He said a cow is a winter. And that was all. That was Cora. What I saw was the road. Gideon Hale ran the Lazy H up on Cedar Bench, a long bench of good grass that sat 40 feet above the river's worst, and the flood had not touched his cattle or his house. So the morning after the worst of it, when the water had quit rising and lay brown and dead across the bottoms with the tops of fence posts and apple trees sticking up out of it, he hitched his 2 big bays and loaded the buckboard with rope and planks and what dry feed we could spare, and he took me down off the bench to see what could be done for the people who had not been so lucky. He did not say much about it. He said, "Get your coat, Levi," and that was the whole of his speech on charity. In the 4 years I had worked his cattle I had learned that Gideon Hale's kindnesses came without words wrapped around them, the way some men's cruelty does. He was not an easy man. I will say that now, and you can hold it in your mind against everything that came after, because if I make him out a saint from the start I will have told you a lie and missed the whole point of him. He was 38 that spring and looked older, big through the shoulders and going gray at the temples, with a face that had set hard around something he never spoke of. I knew the shape of it from the older hands. There had been a wife. Her name was Annie, and there had been a baby coming, and one February 8 years before I came to the bench. A fever had gone through and taken them both inside of a week, the wife and the child she never got to bear. And Gideon Hale had buried them on the rise behind the house under a single cedar and had not, so far as any man living knew, spoken a tender word to a living soul since. He worked. He worked the way other men drink to drown a thing. The Lazy H was the best-run outfit in the valley, because its owner could not bear to be still inside his own house after dark. So you have the man, now the road. We came down the bench trail and onto the river road where it ran above the flood line, and the road was full of people. Whole families were walking it, carrying what the water had left them, bedticks and birdcages and a clock, all of it bound up in wet quilts, heading for the high ground at Rhone's Crossing because they had nowhere else under heaven to go. It is a hard thing to see, a road full of people walking away from everything they own. They did not look at us. They had got past looking at anybody. And in the middle of them, a little apart, walked a woman and a boy. I marked her before Gideon said a word, and I will tell you why. Everybody else on that road walked bent, walked beaten, walked the way the water had left them. She walked straight. Her dress was ruined to the waist with river mud, and she had lost a shoe somewhere and was walking half barefoot on the cold road, and she had a boy of maybe 7 by the hand, and she walked up that road with her chin level like she was going somewhere she had decided on, and not just away from something. She had a flour sack over her shoulder with the whole of her worldly goods in it, and it could not have weighed 8 pounds. The boy was crying without sound. the way children do when they have learned that crying out loud does not bring anybody. And she was not crying at all. She was looking straight up the road like the road owed her an answer. Gideon hauled the bays down to a walk and then to a stop, and the wet leather creaked, and the people parted around the wagon and kept going. He sat looking at the woman a moment. She had stopped too, because the wagon was in her way, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing of begging in her face. That was the thing. Every other soul on that road, if you'd stopped a wagon by them, would have put their hand out or their hope up, one. She just looked at him level, the way one tired animal looks at another, and waited to find out if he was a help or a trouble, and made it plain in the set of her jaw that she would manage either way. "Where's your man?" Gideon said. It was not gentle. It was the way he said everything, flat as a board. "The river's got him," she said. Her voice did not break on it. It was a low voice, steady with the steadiness that costs something. "2 nights back. He went in for the cow." Gideon looked at the boy a while. The boy had quit even his silent crying and was staring at the big bay horses with his mouth open, the way a child will let one wonder push out a grief for half a breath. Then Gideon looked back at the woman, and I watched his hard face for what it would do, and it did not do anything I could read. "Where are you walking to?" he said. "The crossing," she said. "There's a church there. They'll take the boy in maybe till I find work." She said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather, and I understood, young as I was, that she had walked the last 2 days arranging that sentence in her head and getting used to the taste of it. The boy taken in by the church and herself out looking for hire, and that the sentence was the worst thing in the whole flood to her, worse than the husband, worse than the house, and that she had decided not to let it be heard how much it cost her to say. I think that is what did it. I have thought about it for 60 years, and I think it was that she would not let it show. Gideon Hale set the brake. He climbed down off the wagon slow, and he was a big man, and the boy shrank back against his mother's leg, and Gideon went down on one knee in the mud of the road so he was not looming over the child, and he looked at the boy, not the woman, and he said, "What do they call you, son?" "Sam," the boy whispered. "You like horses, Sam?" The boy nodded, all eyes. "I've got 11 up on the bench," Gideon said, "and not near enough hands to gentle the young ones." He stood up. He was talking to the boy, but he had pitched it for the woman, and they both knew it, and he did not look at her while he said the next part, because I think he could not have got it out if he had. "There's a flood took a good deal of feed I'll need hauled and counted before it spoils. And the house up there's been wanting somebody to keep its books straight since my wife died, because I never could make the figures come out and I won't trust them to the bank." He turned the bays off rein in his fist, a thing to do with his hands. "It's work. It's not charity, and I won't have it called that. There's a room off the kitchen was meant for a hired girl and never used. You'd earn it." And then he said the thing that the title of this story is built on, the thing I have heard in my head every day of my life since, said by a man who had not said a soft word in 8 years, said gruff and quick, and looking at the horse's ears so he would not have to look at her face. "Bring the boy." I want to tell you she wept then, or fell on his neck, or blessed him, because that is how it would go in a tale somebody made up. She did none of it. She stood there in the road in one shoe and looked at him a long moment, and I could see her turning it over for the trap in it, because a woman alone on a road has learned that a man's kindness can be the front door of a worse thing than the river. She looked at him hard, and Gideon Hale stood there and let himself be looked at, and did not soften his face to make it easier, which I have come to understand was the most honest thing he could have done, and whatever she saw in him, she found it would do. "I keep books fair," she said, "and I doctor stock. I doctored ours 4 years and never lost one to sickness, only to water." A small fierce lift of her chin. "I'll earn the room or I'll walk on. I won't take a thing I haven't earned." "I'd think less of you if you would," Gideon said. And that was the bargain. He did not help her up onto the wagon, and I understood later that he did it on purpose, that he saw she needed to climb up her own self with the boy under her arm and her flour sack on her shoulder, and that to have lifted her would have been to make her a parcel he was hauling instead of a hand he was hearing. So she climbed up, and the boy after her, and we turned the bays around and went back up the bench trail in the rain with the river roaring below us. And that is how Cora Mercer and her son came to the Lazy H. She did not look back at the water. The boy did, twisted clear around on the seat to watch the brown flood that had his daddy in it shrink away below. But the woman looked up the trail the whole way, up toward the bench, toward whatever came next. And I have thought since that the difference between people who break and people who don't is just exactly that, which way they choose to look while the wagon's still moving. We came up onto Cedar Bench in the last of the light. The rain had quit. There is a thing the country does up there in the evening after rain, when the sun gets under the cloud at the last and lays gold all down the wet grass and lights every drop of water on every blade of it, so the whole bench burns like it's been strewn with broken glass. And Cora Mercer came up over the lip of the trail into that light with her dead husband 2 days behind her in the river, and I saw her look at it. Just for a second, I saw the country go into her through her eyes, the gold grass and the long bench and the cedar and the good house at the end of it, and I saw her decide something. I did not know what. I was 19 and I thought it was relief. It was years before I understood it was a harder and a better thing than relief. It was a woman taking the measure of a place and beginning, against all the sense she had, to let herself want it. The house on the Lazy H was a good house, built of squared logs and added onto in clapboard, with a deep porch that looked west down the bench, and it had not had a woman in it in 8 years, and you could tell. It was clean enough, because Gideon could not abide dirt, but it was dead. There is a deadness a house gets when the man in it only sleeps there. The curtains Annie Hale had hung were still at the windows, gone gray, and her dishes were still in the dresser, and there was a rocking chair by the cold stove that nobody had sat in since the February she died, and Gideon walked past all of it like it wasn't there, which is to say he walked past it the way you walk past a thing you cannot bear to look straight at. He showed Cora the little room off the kitchen. It had a bed and a washstand and a window that looked north to the saddlebacks, and it was meant for one, and she stood in the doorway of it with the boy and did her figuring out loud, plain, the way she did everything. "The boy and I'll share," she said. "He's small, will not be in your way." She set down her flour sack on the bed, the whole of what the river had left her, 8 pounds of it, and she straightened up and looked around the little room like a general looking over poor ground he means to hold anyway, and she said, "I'll want a lamp for the books. I do them at night when the boy's down." "There's lamps," Gideon said from the kitchen, not coming in. "Oil's in the lean-to." And then gruff, already turning away, "There's stew on the back of the stove. It's old but it's hot. The boy ought to eat." He went out to the barn. He did not eat with us that first night, nor for many nights after, and I came to learn it was not pride and it was not coldness, or not only. It was that Gideon Hale had not sat down to a table with a woman and a child since the February the fever took his own, and the sight of Cora ladling stew for her boy at Annie's table was a thing he could feel in the room before he could see it, and he could not bear it yet. So he went and forked hay to horses that did not need it in the dark, which is a thing I have seen grief do to better and worse men than him. But the boy ate. Lord, the boy ate. 2 bowls and the heel of the bread, and Cora watched him eat with her hands quiet in her lap, not eating herself. And when I pushed my own bowl toward her, being 19 and not knowing any better than to be plain about it, she looked at me a moment and something in her face that had been holding hard since the road went the least bit loose, and she said, "Thank you, Levi," which was the first time she said my name, and she ate. She ate like she had not eaten in 2 days, which she had not, but she ate slow and neat and proud, and when she was done she washed the bowls, all of them, mine and the boys and the pot, before she would go to her bed, because she had said she would not take a thing she had not earned, and she meant to start earning it that very night, though it was only the washing of 3 bowls. That was the first day. I have spent more words on it than I meant to, but you cannot understand the rest unless you understand the first day, unless you have got firm in your mind the picture of those 2 of them, the man who had locked a door inside himself 8 years before, and the woman who had walked up a flooded road with her chin level rather than let the world see what it had done to her. Two people made all of grief and grit and pride, and a boy of 7 between them, up on a high bench above a river that had taken everything the boy had ever known. It was not a soft thing that happened up there, the thing I am going to tell you. It did not happen fast, and it did not happen easy, and there was nothing in it of the way young folks think these things go. It happened the way a winter pasture greens, so slow you cannot see it move, and then one day you look and the brown is gone and you cannot rightly say what day it turned. The summer that followed the flood was a hard one for the whole valley, and a strange one on the lazy H. Down in the bottoms the water went off slow, and what it left was worse in some ways than the flood itself. It left the fields under a foot of river silt, gray and stinking, with dead stock half buried in it, and the fences laid flat and the wells fouled. The families that came back to claim their land found it would grow nothing that year, and a good many of them did not come back at all. They went on to the crossing and took what work there was, or they went west, and the quail bottoms that had been the best ground in the county lay empty and gray under the summer sun, and you could stand on the lip of Cedar Bench in July and look down on it, and it was like looking at the floor of a drained sea. Cora used to do that. I would find her at the edge of the bench in the evening sometimes, after the boy was down and the books were done, standing with her arms folded looking down at the dead bottoms, and I knew without asking that somewhere down in that gray waste under the silt was the rectangle of ground where her house had stood and her man was buried, because they never did find Elias Mercer. The river kept him, and she had no grave to go to. So she went to the edge of the bench and looked down at the silt, and that was the nearest thing she had to a grave, and she never let me see her cry over it, though I will not swear she didn't. But up on the bench the work went on, and the work was the saving of her, and I think Gideon Hale knew it would be, which is why he had framed the whole of it as work from the very first word in the road. He had said it was not charity, and he had meant it, and he saw to it that it stayed true. He gave Cora the books, and they were a snarl, 8 years of a grieving man's bad figuring, and she took them into the little room and worked at them by lamplight 3 nights running and came out the 4th morning and laid a single sheet of paper by his coffee and said, "You've been losing money on the Saddleback lease 4 years running. The man you lease it to runs more head on it than he pays for. Here's the count. Here's what he owes you." And Gideon looked at the sheet a long while, and his jaw worked, and he said, "How do you know what he's running up there?" And Cora said, "I climbed up Tuesday and counted them," which was a 6-mile climb she had done on her own legs after her day's work to settle a question in the books. And Gideon Hale looked at her then in a way I had not seen him look at anybody, and he folded the sheet and put it in his shirt. And the next week he rode up to the Saddleback lease and came back with what the man owed him and a new price besides, and he never said thank you, but he raised what he paid her, which from Gideon was the same thing said louder. She doctored the stock too, and she had not lied about that. There was a bunch of young stuff that had come through the wet spring with the foot rot, and the old way on the lazy H was to cut your losses and let the bad ones go, but Cora would not have it. She had Sam and me drive the lame ones into the small corral by the barn, and she went among them every day with a bucket of bluestone wash and a paring knife, and she trimmed and treated every rotten hoof in the bunch, twice a day, for 3 weeks in the heat with the flies bad, and she saved all but 2 of them, and the 2 she could not save she put down herself, quick and clean, with the boy sent up to the house first so he would not see, and she did not flinch at it. Gideon watched her do that work. I caught him at it more than once, standing in the barn's shadow watching her crouched in the corral muck with a 6 steer's foot in her lap, her sleeves rolled and her face set, and I could not read his face, but I learned to read what he did after, and what he did after was start leaving things. A new paring knife on the rail, better than her old one, no word said. A pair of gloves. Once a wide straw hat to keep the sun off her, just hung on the corral post one morning, and Cora found it and looked at it and looked all around to see who'd left it, and nobody owned to it, and she wore it. And that was the first gift Gideon Hale gave her, and neither one of them ever called it one. And the boy, I have to tell you about the boy, because the boy was the crack in the wall. Sam Mercer was 7, and he had lost his father and his home and his whole known world in a single night, and for a good while that summer he was a quiet, watchful little fellow who startled at loud sounds and would not let his mother out of his sight for long. But a boy is a boy, and there were 11 horses on the bench, and the boy could not stay away from them. He started by watching from the fence. Then he was inside the fence. Then he was up on the lowest rail with a handful of grass held out to the gentle old mare. And then Gideon, who had said in the road that he hadn't hands enough to gentle the young stock, started, without ever announcing it, to teach the boy how. It was a thing to see. This great silent grieving man who could not sit at a table with the child's mother would spend an hour in the cool of the evening showing Sam how to walk up on a colt from the near side, how to let it smell the back of your hand, how to stand quiet and let the animal come to you instead of grabbing after it. You can't make a thing trust you, I heard him tell the boy once, the two of them sitting on the top rail in the dusk watching the colts. You can only be the same every day till it decides to. Then it's worth something because it chose it. And the boy nodded solemn, and I do not think Gideon Hale heard his own words, but I did, standing in the barn door, and so, I found out later, did Cora, who had come out to call the boy to bed and stopped in the shadow of the house when she heard the man's low voice, and stood and listened to him say a thing about trust that was about a colt and was not only about a colt, and went back inside without calling the boy at all, and let him stay out late on the rail with the hard man. Because she had heard something in it she wanted her son to have. So the summer went. The two grown people did not court. I want to be plain about that because it was not a courtship, not for a long time, not in any way you would name. They worked the same ranch and ate at the same table finally, by midsummer, when Gideon's grief had worn down enough at the edges that he could bear to sit at Annie's table with the woman and the boy, though he sat at the foot of it and said little and got up first. They were polite. They were more than polite, they were careful with each other, the deep careful of two people who have each been broken once and have learned exactly how much it costs, and are in no hurry to risk it again. He never touched her. She never angled for him. If you had ridden up onto the Lazy H that July and watched them an hour you would have said, there is a hard rancher and his hired bookkeeper and her boy, and you would have seen nothing else because there was nothing else to see on the surface of it. But I lived there. I slept in the bunk off the barn and I ate at that table and I saw the things underneath. I saw that Gideon started shaving of a morning which he had not troubled to do regular before. I saw that Cora started putting a flower, just a wild thing, a lupin or a paintbrush in a cup on the table, and that Gideon, who would have called such a thing foolishness, never said a word against it, and once when she forgot, asked where it was, gruff, like the lack of it bothered him. I saw that, when Cora climbed the saddleback to count stock, Gideon found a reason his work took him up that way the same afternoon. I saw that he started building, of an evening in the lean-to, and would not say what, and that what it turned out to be, after some weeks, was a proper second bedstead, a small one, a boy's bed, planed and pegged and good, and that he set it up in the little room off the kitchen one Sunday when Cora was at the wash, so that when she came in the boy had a bed of his own and did not have to share hers any more. And she stood in the doorway of that little room and looked at the small good bed a man had made in secret for her son, and she put her hand over her mouth, and that was the only time that whole summer I ever saw Cora Mercer come near to breaking over a bedstead, because a bedstead was a thing that said stay in a way no word had yet. She did not thank him for it out loud. She had learned his language by then. What she did was bake him a dried apple pie, which she had not done before, and set it at his place at supper, and Gideon looked at the pie and looked at her, and they did not say one word about beds or pies, and he ate 2 pieces of it, which from that man was a love letter. It would be a sweeter tale if I could leave it there, two broken people mending slow on a high green bench while a boy gentled colts in the evening light. But the frontier did not let anybody mend in peace, and there were two hard things came at the lazy H that summer and fall that I have to tell, because the measure of those two people was taken in the hard things, not the soft ones, and you have not got the whole of them yet. The screwworm came in August, the way it always came on the heat. If you have not ranched in that country you will not know the dread of it, so I will tell you plain. The fly lays its egg in any open wound on a beast, the smallest nick or the navel of a new calf or the raw place where a horn's been knocked, and the thing that hatches eats the living animal from that wound outward, and a steer that is sound at dawn can be down and dying by the third day, and a whole herd can go in a fortnight if a man is slow or unlucky. It was the terror of every outfit in the valley, and that August it came hard, worse than anyone could remember, and they said afterward it was the flood that did it. All that dead stock left rotting and the silt down in the bottoms breeding flies by the million, and the flies came up onto the benches looking for the living. Gideon Hale knew his business and he had got out ahead of most of it. We rode the herd hard, every day, 2 and 3 times, cutting out any beast with a wound and roping it and treating the wound before the fly could find it. It is brutal work in the August heat, all day in the saddle in the dust with the balling and the flies, and Gideon worked it harder than any two of his hands, because the lazy H was the only thing he had left to pour himself into, and he would not lose it to a fly. But there is only so much 3 men can ride, and we were 3, Gideon and me and old Tobe Yancey, who had cooked and wrangled for the outfit 20 years and was past the hard riding though he'd never say it. And a herd of 400 head spread over a big bench is too much for 3 to cover close, and we started to lose them. 2 the first week, 5 the next. And Gideon Hale's face, which had got the least bit easier over the summer, went back to stone, and he stopped coming in for supper again, and rode out before light and came back after dark, gray with dust and grief at the losing, and the thing that had been thawing on that bench froze up overnight, because grief had come back and grief was the one country Gideon Hale knew how to live in. It was Cora who broke it, of course it was. She came out to the corral the 3rd morning of the bad week, where Gideon was saddling in the dark to ride out. And she had Sam's slate in her hand with figures on it, and she stood at his stirrup and said, "You're losing them because you're riding for the worm after it's already in them. You're a day behind it and you'll stay a day behind it till the frost." Gideon, tired past courtesy, said something short to her, that she kept the books and he kept the cattle and the cattle were his trade not hers, and Cora did not give an inch. She had doctored stock 4 years on her own place and she had been reading on it besides, in the 2 farm papers that came to the house that nobody but her ever opened, and she stood there in the dark and she said, "I doctored a screwworm summer on our place and lost 4 head out of 60. You've lost 7 out of 400 and it's only the start of August. You want to do it your way and lose your herd, or you can hear me." And there was a silence, and old Tobe by the barn quit even breathing, because nobody talked to Gideon Hale like that, and I waited for the storm. And it did not come. Gideon Hale stood with his hand on the saddle horn and his back to her a moment, and then he turned around and he said, tired but not hard, "Then I'll hear you." What she had was this. "You do not chase the worm," she said, "you cut it off at the door. Every wound on the place is a door. So you do not look for sick cattle, you look for fresh hurts, every day, and you close them before the fly can use them. Every cut and scrape and every new calf's navel, painted with the tar wash the very hour it happens. And you bring the whole herd in off the big bench into the home pastures where 3 men can see them close instead of leaving them scattered where you can't. And you pen the young stuff and the fresh cut all together near the barn where she could tend them herself by day while we 3 rode the rest. It meant tighter grazing, and it meant more handwork, and it meant Cora taking on the whole hospital end of it herself, the close nasty doctoring, all day in the heat with the flies, the boy carrying her bucket and her rags. And Gideon listened to the whole of it, and at the end of it he said one word. He said, "Tobe," and old Tobe said, "Yes, sir," and Gideon said, "Bring them in." And that was that. He had handed the management of the worst trouble of the year to a woman he'd hired off a flooded road 4 months before, in front of his men. And he did it because she was right and he could see she was right. And I have worked for a good many men since, and I can tell you that the rare ones, the ones worth working for, are exactly the ones who can do that. Hand the reins to whoever's got the better hand, and not feel small for it. It worked, Lord, it worked. We brought them in close, and we rode the home pastures 3 times a day, and we painted every fresh hurt on the place the hour we found it. And Cora ran her open-air hospital by the barn from first light to dark with her sleeves rolled and her straw hat on and the boy at her heels. And after that 3rd week of August, the lazy H did not lose another head to the worm. Not one. Clear to the frost. And the outfits all around us that did it the old way lost cattle into October. Gideon Hale came in off the range the evening it broke, the evening we all knew we'd turned it, and he stood at the corral fence in the last light and watched Cora finish the day's doctoring, watched her swab the last calf and turn it out and straighten up with her hand to the small of her back, dead tired, filthy, smelling of tar and bluestone. And there was a look on his stone face I had never seen there in 4 years and have not got out of my mind since. It was not a hired man looking at a good hand. I was 19, and even I knew that much. He watched her a long minute, and then he climbed the fence into the corral, which he did not need to do, and he took the heavy bucket out of her hand to carry it for her, which he had never done, and they walked up to the house together in the dusk not saying anything, the man carrying the bucket and the woman walking beside him with her hat in her hand and her hair coming down, and the boy running ahead. And I stood at the barn and watched the 3 of them go up to the house in the gold light. And I thought. Though I could not have said why I thought it there. That's it, that's the thing happening, and it was. But the country was not done with them, and neither was the town. And that brings me to the second hard thing, which was the banker, Ode Trull. I do not want to make Ode Trull out a villain, because he was not one exactly, and I have come to believe the truer and harder lesson of that whole autumn is that the thing which most nearly broke Cora and Gideon was not a wicked man at all, but only a respectable one, and the cold, ordinary opinion of decent townsfolk, which can do more quiet harm than any outlaw. Trull held the paper on half the valley out of his bank at Roan's Crossing, and after the flood he held more of it, because the ruined bottom farmers had borrowed against their hopes to start over, and a good many could not pay. And Trull, who was not cruel but was careful the way money is careful, came to see opportunity in the gray drowned bottoms, because land is cheapest when the man who owns it is drowning, and he set about buying up the flooded bottom farms for pennies on their worth, meaning to hold them till the river silt turned, as silt does, into the richest ground in the county, and sell them on at a fortune. It was legal. It was even, by the lights of the town, shrewd and admirable. And one of the drowned farms he wanted was the Mercer place, Cora's place, Elia's place, the rectangle of ground under the silt where her husband lay. He rode up to the Lazy H one Sunday in September in a good buggy with a clerk beside him, and he was all courtesy, and he found Cora on the porch, and he tipped his hat to her and called her ma'am, and he laid it out plain and reasonable. The Mercer land was hers now, the widow's, he said, such as it was, a drowned quarter-section under a foot of silt, worth nothing to a woman alone and never to be farmed again in her lifetime, and he would do her the kindness of taking it off her hands for cash money, here, today, enough to give her and the boy a fresh start somewhere away from all the sorrow of this valley. He had the papers in his clerk's case. He was, I am sure, well pleased with himself for his charity in offering a drowned widow cash for worthless mud. And Cora Mercer stood up off the porch step, and she looked at that good buggy and that careful man, and she said, "My husband's in that ground, Mr. Trull." Trull gently said he understood, said it was a hard thing, but that the dead were with the Lord and not the soil, and that a sentiment, however natural, was a poor thing to feed a boy on, and that his offer was a generous one and would not stand open forever, the way these things were. And Cora said, "I'll not sell the ground my husband's buried into a man who means to grow rich on it. Quiet, level, the chin. Not for your money and not for double it. It's not for sale. Good day." It was a fine thing to say and a proud thing. And it would have been a foolish thing too. The kind of pride that ruins a woman with a child and no means, except for what happened next, which I did not expect and Troll did not expect, and I am not sure even Cora expected. The door of the house opened, and Gideon Hale came out onto the porch. He had been inside. He had heard the whole of it through the open window. And he came out and he stood beside Cora, not in front of her, beside her, and he said to Ode Troll in that flat, hard voice, "You heard the lady." And Troll, who held paper on half the valley and was used to being the most powerful man on any porch he stood on, looked at Gideon Hale, who held no paper to any man and owned his bench free and clear and feared nothing on this earth, because the worst thing the earth could do to him, it had already done 8 years before. And Ode Troll did some figuring of his own, and gathered his clerk and his case, and tipped his hat, and got back in his good buggy, and drove down off the bench. And he did not come back. He bought up the rest of the bottoms. He grew rich on them in time just as he'd planned. But he never got the Mercer quarter section, and Cora kept it, the drowned ground with her husband in it, worth nothing, and held on to it out of pure stubborn love, and you remember that she kept it, because the river was not done turning, and there is one more thing the land did at the very end of this that I will get to. That night after the boy was down, Cora and Gideon sat on the porch in the dark a long while, not talking, the way they did. And then Gideon Hale said the longest speech I ever heard him make, and I had it from Cora years later, word for word, because she kept it the way you keep the few words that turn a life. He said, "When Annie died, I quit. I didn't lay down and die, I went on, but I quit. I told myself a man gets one. One wife, one home, one shot at it, and I'd had mine and lost it, and that was the end of the account. I built this place up out of spite near about, to have a thing to do with my hands so I wouldn't have to feel the house empty." He was quiet a while. "Then there was a flood and a road, and you walked up it with that boy and you wouldn't bend, and I stopped my wagon, and I have been lying to myself every day since about why." Another silence, the hardest one. "I'm not asking you anything. You came here off a hard road, and the last thing you need is a stove-up old rancher asking you for something you'd feel bound to give for the room and board. So I'm not asking. I'm just telling you that I was wrong about the account, that a man might get a second one. And that if there ever came a day you wanted to stay on this bench not as my hand but as," and here Cora said, "the hardest man in the valley could not get the word out and sat there in the dark with it stuck in him," and Cora said, "I let him sit with it a minute, and then I said it for him. I said, 'As your wife.' And he said, 'Yes,' just that. 'Yes.' Like I'd done the figuring on a thing he couldn't make come out the same as the books." She did not say yes to him that night. That is the part that tells you who she was. She had loved Elias Mercer and lost him 4 months before under a river, and she would not give her yes cheap or quick to climb out of her trouble, because to do that would have made it the very thing Gideon swore it wasn't, a woman taking shelter for the room and board. She told him she would not answer in the same season she'd buried her husband, that he had taught her boy that you cannot make a thing trust you. You can only be the same every day till it chooses, and that she meant to hold him to his own lesson. And Gideon Hale, who had said that very thing to her son on a corral rail in the summer dusk, took his own medicine and said that was fair, and that he would be the same every day and wait. The autumn turned, and the wait Gideon Hale had promised her was a long one, and I watched him keep it, which was a thing worth watching. He was the same every day. That was the whole of his courting, and it was the most eloquent courting I ever saw, because it was the one language that woman could believe. He did not press her. He did not soften toward her in front of the men to claim her, nor cool toward her to punish the waiting. He got up in the dark and worked the cattle and came in at dark and ate at the foot of the table and was decent and steady and unchanged, day on day on day, through September and October and into the first hard weather. And the only sign of what was working in him was the small things, which were the things Annie's empty house had been starving for 8 years. He fixed the gray curtains, took them down one day, and Cora washed them white again, and he never said a word, but he carried the ladder. He mended the rocking chair by the stove that had sat broken and untouched since the February his wife died, sanded it and rocker and all, and set it back by the warm stove. And the first evening Cora sat down in it with her mending, the man stood in the doorway and looked at a woman rocking in his dead wife's chair by his stove, the thing he could not have borne to see in the spring, and his hard face did not break, but something behind it eased, the way a long-held breath eases. And he went and sat down across from her, and they did not talk, and that was the happiest I had yet seen that house, two people not talking by a stove with a boy asleep in the next room. The first snow came early that year, in November, a big one that shut the bench off from the crossing for 9 days. And there is no test of people like being shut up close together by weather, and I have seen weather make enemies of families, but those 9 snowbound days were the days the last of the ice went out of Cora Mercer, because for 9 days the 4 of us, the 2 grown folks and the boy and me, lived close in that warm house while it howled white outside, and there was nowhere to be careful and distant. And Cora saw Gideon Hale not as the hard rancher of the daylight, but as a man in his own house of an evening. A man who whittled a horse out of pine for her boy by the fire and got it wrong twice and started over without complaint. A man who read out loud of an evening from the one book of poems that had been Annie's because the boy asked him to, and he could not say no to the boy. A man whose hard voice gentled when he read, who was, under the 8 years of stone, exactly as tender as Cora had begun to hope and had been afraid to believe. On the 7th snowbound night, with the wind down at last and the stars hard and bright over the white bench and the boy asleep and old Tobe snoring in the kitchen corner, Cora Mercer came and stood by Gideon's chair at the fire, and she said his name, just his name, Gideon, which she had never used before. It had always been Mr. Hale, and he looked up and she said, "The season's turned." And it had. It was a new season. She had buried Elias in the spring, and it was winter now, full winter, a whole turn of the year between her grief and this fire, and she had held to her own rule and let it be the same every day until she chose, and now she chose. "If you'll still have us," she said, "the boy and me, we'll stay." Gideon Hale stood up out of his chair. And the hardest man in the valley, the man who had not wept since a February 8 years gone, who had buried a wife and a child, he never got to hold and walled the grief up and lived behind the wall. That man took Cora Mercer's 2 hands in his 2 hands by the fire, and he could not speak, and he did not try to, and the tears went down his stone face into his gray beard, and he did not wipe them, and Cora reached up and wiped them for him, gentle with her thumb. The way she'd have done for the boy, and that was the whole of it. That was the moment, no grand words. 2 broken people who had each been sure their account was closed, finding by a winter fire that it was not, that there was a second one after all, and taking it, with the snow deep and the boy asleep and an old cook snoring in the corner and a 19-year-old hand pretending hard to be asleep in the loft, and watching the whole of it through the rail with his throat tight, which I was, and which I have never been ashamed of. They were married in the spring, a year almost to the day from the flood, by the circuit preacher in the front room of the house on cedar bench, with the gray curtains washed white at the windows and lupin in a jar on the table, and the boy in a new shirt standing up beside them holding the ring. Cora wore a plain dress, not white. She'd not pretend to be a girl and didn't need to, and she was the most beautiful thing I ever saw come into that room, not for the dress but for the look on her. The look of a woman who had walked up a flooded road a year before with nothing left and her chin level rather than be pitied, and who had earned every day with her own 2 hands and her own stubborn will the home she now stood in. Nobody gave Cora Mercer anything. You remember that. Gideon Hale stopped a wagon on a road, that was all. He opened a door, and everything that came through it she carried through herself. He was always proudest of that, and so was she. "He never took me in," she told me once years on, correcting me when I'd said it careless. "Folks always say he took us in. He didn't. He hired me, and I earned my way, and then I married him because I wanted to and not because I had to, and that's the only kind of taking in worth a thing. And she was right, and I have never said it the other way since. There is one more thing, and then I am done, because I promised you the land had a last turn in it. You remember Cora kept her drowned quarter section down in the bottoms, the worthless silt-buried ground with Elias in it, that she would not sell to Ode Troll for any money because her husband lay in it. She kept it out of love and stubbornness, and everyone in the valley but Gideon thought her a fool for it, holding tax ground that grew nothing. But silt turns. The old men had always said it, and they were right. It took years, but the river silt that drowned the bottoms rotted down into the richest black bottomland in the whole county, and the farms Ode Trull had bought up cheap made him his fortune just as he'd schemed. And the Mercer quarter section, when it turned, was as black and deep and fine as any of them. And Cora would not sell it even then, when it was worth a great deal, because it was never about the worth. What she did with it, when Sam was grown, was give it to him, the boy who'd lost his father in the flood that made that ground, and Sam Mercer farmed his father's quarter section, the richest in the bottoms, all his life, and raised his own children on it. And there is a Mercer farming it yet, down in the Quail bottoms, the great-grandchildren of a man the river took and a woman who would not bend. And they do not any of them know the whole story, but I do, and now you do, and that is why I have told it. Gideon and Cora Hale lived more than 30 years on Cedar Bench. They had 2 more children of their own besides Sam, and the house that had been dead 8 years was the loudest, warmest, best-fed house in the valley for the rest of both their lives, and the rocking chair by the stove was never empty again, and there was always a wildflower in a cup on the table. Every season there was one to find, and in the dead of winter when there wasn't, Gideon Hale, who had once thought such a thing foolishness, would whittle one out of pine so the cup would not stand empty. And I have one of those pine flowers on my own mantle to this day, gone smooth and gold with age, that he gave me the spring I left the Lazy H to start my own outfit, and I look at it every day of my life. He went first, Gideon did, an old man in his bed with his wife's hand in his, and they say his last word was her name. And Cora lived on a few years after, sharp and straight to the end, and she is buried up on the rise behind the house under the old cedar, beside Annie Hale, which was Cora's own wish. The 2 wives of Gideon Hale side by side under the one tree, and I have always thought there was a largeness in that, in Cora's choosing to lie down at last next to the woman whose empty chair she'd filled. 2 women who between them had loved one hard good man across a whole long life, and a flood, and a fever in 40 years, and I cannot say it any better than the bare fact of it says itself. I am the last one left who saw the road. I was 19 on the seat of that buckboard in the rain, and I am very old now, and when I am gone there will be no one alive who watched Gideon Hale climb down into the mud and kneel to a frightened boy and say, "Bring the boy." And so I have set it down, the whole of it, the way it was, no softer and no harder than the truth. It rained the morning of Cora's funeral. A soft spring rain, the gentle kind, the kind the quail ran low and easy under, the far thing from the flood that started it all. And I stood up on Cedar Bench in that soft rain by the 2 graves under the cedar, an old man with my hat in my hand, and I looked down off the bench the way Cora used to, down at the black bottoms where her first husband lay and her son still farmed, all of it green and growing in the rain, and I thought about how the same river that takes everything from you is the one that lays down the ground your grandchildren grow rich on. If you can only hold on long enough and not bend and not sell the thing you love for any careful man's money, and I thought that was the whole of what those 2 taught me, and I have tried to live by it, and I have mostly failed, and I have never once stopped trying, and I am content. The house still stands on Cedar Bench. There is a Hale in it, and there is a wildflower in a cup on the table. I would bet my life on it, because some things, once a thing like Cora Mercer starts them, do not stop.